So we're going to do another episode of Penguin Pod. We've got Beccy with us again, which is brilliant. And this time we're going to talk a little bit about my experience as a parent with a child with autism spectrum disorder. I'm doing the fingers thing again, Beccy, the thing that you did before.
The fingers needs to become a regular thing, doesn't it?
Yes, the inverted commas disorder. Yeah, so we're going to sort of switch it around a bit today.
Thank you for having me back. It's very nice to be interviewing you on your own podcast. So let's start at the beginning. When did you first suspect that your son might be autistic? Like, was there an aha moment? Was it a gradual over time thing? What happened?
It's interesting because I thought for a lot longer that my son's autistic. And I dealt with that thing where everybody is saying, no, don't be silly, because autism is this and your son isn't this. So, for example, he made eye contact with me. He was very advanced verbally. So he was using full sentences by the age of 2. He would laugh and he would respond to being tickled and stuff like that. And as he grew a little bit older, he was very funny and very quick. And all of those things, some people assume are indicative of neurotypical, which is actually quite offensive, I think, probably to autistic people, because that's just BS, really. But we did have a critical moment when my son it was just before he turned 3. It was about 2 years and 10 months, and we took him to see BB's World, which is at Alton Towers, which is a theme park in the Midlands. And we had watched quite a bit of CBeebies. He was really into Postman Pat. He really liked the Go-Jetters. There was a number of programs which I would have said were his favorites. And we took him to CBeebies World, CBeebies Land, or whatever it's called. And it started okay. We went on the Postman Pat ride. That was good. And my memory of it is that as soon as that had finished, he basically fell apart a bit. The biggest moment for me was we were queuing up to go into a show, which was the Furchester Hotel, which, for those that don't know, is like a Sesame Street kind of characters. It's got the Cookie Monster in it and it's got Elmo in it. And it was a live show. We queued up, we went in, and there were obviously lots and lots of other children with their parents, and they all sat down and the lights went down because the show was about to start, and then the characters came out. And my son stood up with his hands over his ears, pointing at the stage, shouting, "Too loud, too loud." And we obviously then exited as soon as we could because we realized it wasn't going to work. But just for a split second, I remember looking around at all these other kids, similar sort of ages, sitting there chilling with their parents and thinking, you know, there's something that's not operating in quite the same way as these other children. So we obviously removed him from the situation. We calmed down, and we then went to Mr. Tumble Sensory Garden, which was another thing that they had there. And he just calmed down. We sat in there for ages, and I have a photo that I took of him. And in the photo, I can see that he's waving at the camera and he's trying to smile. But to me, it's a little boy who knows this is something that he should enjoy. And he recognizes that this is something really good and special, and that this is something that he wants to enjoy, but he just isn't enjoying it. So he's got this like internal turmoil, really. And I thought, oh, wow, you poor kid. So I think after that, we went to I forget which TV program it was about, but they had a 4D projector on the floor, which when the children interacted with it, this particular one had fish fingers, which were like fish. And so they were in like a projection of water. And as you stood on them, they kind of moved around. And he just ran around it for about 10 minutes. Loved it. He absolutely loved it. And I said to my husband, we're not going to rush out of here, because if this is what he wants to do, then this is what we'll do. So for me, that I thought, no, there's something different. There's something not neurotypical. I didn't have that language at the time. Yeah.
Well, that's when I think it's so interesting, isn't it? Because that's when later, I don't know about for you, but like when you do get that language, you're like, oh, suddenly everything makes sense. Because I think before that, you do often have this like experience of, like you said, going on what should be like, this is a fantastic day out. This is what families do. And like, even your son at that point was going, feeling like you saw that look in his eye, like, I feel like I'm supposed to enjoy this, but like, what part of me is, this isn't working for me?
There are so many things where during his childhood so far, I have assumed this is what families do, and I've realized actually no, this is not what my family needs to be doing. So for example, extracurricular clubs. Yeah, I remember thinking, oh, he's going to join Beavers or Brownies. He'll do some sort of after school club with his friends. He just hasn't enjoyed that kind of element at all. And so we realized, no, we're just not going to push the after school thing at all. Sometimes just getting him out of the house, you know, is a big challenge, but I think you can probably relate to that.
Definitely. But I feel like, but you guys have like, so you've not done those things though, but you've done lots of other awesome things together, right? I mean, I feel like, you know, of all the people I know, you're like, you've just been amazing at coming up with like, you guys have a lot of fun together, right?
We have loads of fun. Well, first of all, I've really enjoyed being a parent, and I feel like it's, you know, I know not everybody automatically feels like they're comfortable with the idea of play. And I think that's something we really should talk about more. I think as parents, we talk about sort of how to potty train and how to do this, that, and the other, but encouraging parents to feel comfortable with the idea of just being silly and getting on the floor with their kids and entering their world. I think there's just an assumption that we're all automatically going to know how to do that or feel okay doing that or kind of let ourselves go enough to do that. But actually, it is so far away from anything else that's expected of us as an adult. I think it doesn't come naturally to a lot of people. And that's kind of what Penguin Parenting is trying to do in some of its video series, is just kind of say, look, here's some simple ideas of how to play this or how to do this or how to use a piece of paper and a pen, you know. But yeah, so what we've done is I've just kind of met him where he's at. So he's had a lot of very intense interests, which have tended to last sort of 1 to 2 years, and it'll be that and nothing else. So I've just sort of entered that world with him. So it was pirates, and then it was dinosaurs, and then it was Harry Potter for a while, Minecraft, although Minecraft's kind of a background thing that's sort of still there. And at the moment it's Doctor Who. And then we sort of build the play around that interest rather than trying to fit into sort of something else. So it's been a very organic kind of creative way of raising him, because that's what he's responded to.
Definitely. I feel like a lot of parents think, oh, that, you know, autism is something to be afraid of maybe, or neurodiversity generally. But, you know, you've said before, like, these kids are awesome, right? What are some of the things that you love about your son?
Well, first of all, he's absolutely hilarious. I don't know whether he's an only child, so he spends a lot of time with adults. And I therefore think he's got quite an adult sense of humor. I don't mean adult in a blue way, obviously. I mean just kind of grown up sense of humor. He's very sarcastic, and I'm really proud of that. He is just hilarious. He's really quick. But his imagination is the thing that makes him really stand out for me. He has his own worlds. And I think every child, every person has an imagination. It's just what we do with it, right? And what we do with it as we grow away from childhood into adulthood. He just has like an endless ability to create new worlds. And when you're in things like Doctor Who and Harry Potter and all of these other worlds that have lore, Lore, associated with them, you know, you realize how impressive it is to come up with a world like that. But he can do it, and he adds bits on, and he writes fan fiction. It's been fascinating. The other thing is, apart from the fact that he's just a wonderful kid, slightly biased, is he's got this particular skill in art, which we discovered when he was about 4. My dad is a really, really good artist, and it's wonderful to see it come through in my son. We have just basically agreed kind of as a family, if it's something to do with art, we'll just let him do it. Now, that's a very privileged thing to say, because we can do that. We can say, like, if he needs a certain type of pen or he wants more paint, you know, we'll just provide that for him, because we just want to see where it goes, because clearly he's got a flair for it, like a real gift. And we want to encourage him that that is something that's part of who he is. On his first day at reception, when he was 4, he drew a picture, and his teacher took him to the head and took him to see the art specialist teacher in the school, because she just couldn't believe that he'd drawn this. So he's always been kind of encouraged by anybody that sees him draw anything, really. So I think whatever your child shows a flair in, whatever it is, just make the space for that. Because I think if your child is neurodivergent, they're going to come across a lot of you can't, or you shouldn't, or you won't be able to. And I think just always having that bit of, but this is something you excel at, right? It's not a question of something to fall back on. It's like, actually, he might not be the best at making friends or going to loud parties, but, you know, he could trump you in an art contest. So,
Absolutely.
you know, yeah.
I think that's really important, isn't it? Like for them, and also, you know, as a parent, like you say, because otherwise it's easy to put the attention on like those moments when, yeah, he's at CBeebies land and he's going, it's too loud, and you think all the other kids are enjoying, like, so you're like,
Yeah.
oh, that's something you don't get to have. But actually there are so many ways in which, you know, my son totally has sensory sensitivities that, you know, other kids clearly don't have. But I've also noticed for him, some of it is about, like, I think it's about how in control he feels about the experience.
Absolutely.
And also, you know, so there are some places, like, for example, you know, yeah, in certain contexts, like a loud noise will really upset him. I mean, he absolutely, to be honest, like, he hates the fire alarm. Like, the fire alarm is kind of, I think also partly because it's unexpected, you know, and it is designed to make you jump, isn't it? After all, that's what a fire alarm does. But then there'll be other things where he will love, like, a really, you know, if it's like a football tournament or something else where people are like shouting and screaming and he's all part of it, like, he will absolutely lap it up. So it's all about context and about, again, I think his ability to kind of choose or not to choose the situation.
The only thing I have to say in response to that is my son plays the drums and he absolutely hates noises. So that's exactly it.
So what made you, like, when did you had that moment at CBeebies land, like, when did you think about getting a diagnosis? Like, was that something that happened quickly or over time?
Well, when we used to talk to the preschool quite a lot, not about autism, but about just his particular needs, and he had various difficulties. Preschool was brilliant though, because obviously it is quite child-centered, isn't it? And you get into the regular school and obviously they've got a greater number of children to deal with. Things have to be a lot more regimented. That's just the way the system is. So when we started school, I had a couple of conversations with his teacher, and quite quickly I was talking to the SENCO, which is Special Educational Needs Coordinator, for those who don't know, who was very good. And he was saying, you know, it's a bit early at this point to look at anything formal, but let's just address the needs that he does have. So we went down that route. And then it was the beginning of year 2, actually. So he would have been 6. And I had a meeting with his new teacher and the SENCO. And I remember saying, look, you know, I think maybe we should go for assessment. And they both were like, yep. And that kind of confirmation that, yes, they're seeing sufficient signs. So that's when we decided to go down that route formally.
Sure. And did they help you with that?
So the school did the initial forms. We went through the NHS route. September 2021 was when the forms officially went in and we entered the pathway. I was then told it was going to be about 18 months to 2 years on the waiting list, which is absolutely fine. You know, he was 6 at the time. There's no mad rush. And we finally got a diagnosis in March or April of this year, so 2024. So that was basically just over 2.5 years from actually starting the assessment. But obviously for me, the evolution of my thinking, you know, what might help my child, what might be going on for him in terms of his sensory needs, which were always quite evident, and other things that he's struggling with. So yeah, that's what happened. I'll talk a bit about the assessment actually. In our area, I was put in touch with I can't remember quite what they called her, but something like a pathway coordinator. And her role specifically is to kind of walk with parents through the process. So she's available to talk about specific issues, but also about the process and how it's going. There were various stages, like at a certain few months in, we got another set of forms to look at, and then, you know, and then it went on. And then I think it was in January this year, I had a phone call from the NHS to say, would you mind if we basically pass you off to a third party? So because they were trying to clear the backlog, they'd received a bit of funding to take, I think she said 1,000 cases that were on the books and to give them to a third party. So basically a private assessor that the NHS kind of co-opted in. And I said, yeah, whatever, as long as it's quick, you know, if that's fine, it's the same process. So we were sent to a private company, and it did move fairly quickly after that. And we had an online assessment. Yours was in person, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we
what
had.
Was that like, the online one? Because I think
Yeah,
a lot
the
of people
actual
didn't realize
the
it's an
day of.
option.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think we could have refused to do the online, but we were just thinking, well, you know, it probably doesn't make much difference at this point. We're all so used to doing things online. So my son had an hour online assessment where the lady was just talking with him and asking him to do tasks, tell stories and interpret things and what have you. And then we took him to school because this was in the morning of a school day. And then we had a parent assessment. I forget what bit it's called, which went on for almost 4 hours. And she kept saying, well, when you get the report, obviously there'll be advice about how to help it. And then she said, oh, but obviously I'm not saying anything. So she was trying not to indicate what the outcome would be.
Yeah.
But, I think it was pretty obvious to her. And then it was about another 6 weeks or so, and it just dropped into the inbox, and it was a 20-page report. And like you, I just read the headline, autism spectrum disorder, hate that word, disorder.
Yeah.
And then loads of other things. And they'd screened for other sorts of things as well, like ADHD and OCD.
Yeah.
But I've still not shown him the report, and he's not asked to see it. And the reason I don't particularly want to show him is because of the negative terms in which it's written.
Sure. Yeah.
Which is part of the pathologizing. And I recognize the purpose of doing that. It just doesn't read very, very well.
Yeah.
For a 9-year-old child.
Yeah, no, totally. Makes sense. And yeah, how were school then, like throughout that whole process? Like, were they supportive? Because some people have the experience that where school is like, no, I don't see this at all.
Generally, the school have been really good. I think the Senko really knows what he's talking about. And what they've said all along is basically we deal with the needs as they present themselves. So it doesn't really matter from their perspective whether he has a diagnosis or not. If your son is presenting with anxiety or struggling to get to school or any other thing and he's had all of these things, those are the things we'll address, whether we think he's autistic or not. So that makes a lot of sense to me. When the diagnosis came through, I asked for a meeting just to discuss the diagnosis, but there was nothing really specific. There was sort of a few recommendations that they'd made for the school, none of which they particularly wanted to take on. And I wasn't that bothered really, because at this point, he's actually coping really well in the year that he's in now. This year in particular, he's found a really good friend, and that's been the making of him really socially. But year 2, he had a lot of school refusal, and that was a very, very hard year. So they probably put more things in place that year than they had done in any other year.
Sure.
The kinds of things that school have done in terms of concessions pre-diagnosis, and this is why I think anybody that sees their child struggling, whether the school see it or not, whether you are likely to seek any sort of diagnosis or not, talk to your school, talk to your Senko and get it registered, keep notes of meetings and ask for specific things that you think will help them. So my son in year 2, bearing in mind we were still within the pandemic, they allowed him to bring a certain stuffed toy to school. Nobody was allowed to bring toys. They allowed him to do it, and he could have it sat on his desk, and he had it with him, I think, at break times as well. And that was specifically because it was his comfort thing. And he felt like him and said stuffed toy were going to school, as opposed to him just going on his own. And it just made that transition between home and school easier. So that was a quite a simple thing that I could ask them to do, or that they suggested doing. Mm-hmm. The things they've not been very good at have been things like, I don't mean to be unkind, but anything where it would actually involve them making a significant change. So my son struggles with lots of sensory issues, one of which is smell. So in the dining hall on certain days, they have meals which he just can't stand the smell. And on those days, he just won't touch his lunch. So he has a packed lunch, which is the only way we can get him to eat. Feeding an autistic child is a whole other series.
Yeah.
Right? We'll maybe do that. But I have said to them, can he sit somewhere else? Is it possible he could go in a classroom so he can at least eat his lunch without feeling sick? And we've variously been told no, or yes, he can go in the library. But the problem with the library is one teacher would say, yes, he can, but then the door was shut. And the act of getting up off his seat, walking to the door and opening a door when there's a different teacher on duty, he's so hell-bent on not getting in trouble. Like his big thing is about being a good boy. He just automatically felt like he'd be told off. So he just sat there. And so he's come home a few times with a full packed lunch and a sick bag, like the type you might get on an airplane, which, because the welfare assistants haven't known what to do, and so they've just let him sit there with a sick bag. Obviously empty. He hasn't actually been sick. But the point is, if you know he's feeling that poorly, please let him just leave the hall.
Yeah.
So sometimes things which just would be difficult for the school to or would take a bit of effort for them to accommodate, they just haven't. So
Yeah.
bit hit and miss.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the times, I guess it's that thing, like you could have a good relationship with one member of staff or like a few
Yeah.
people that are quite clued in, but then, if there's a different teacher for the day or like, and that information doesn't get passed on, then it can be quite upsetting for them, can't it? And quite challenging sometimes because, yeah, like all of a sudden you got this new person who probably doesn't even know they're autistic, right? Or that has anything else, kind of going on. So yeah, they just have to sort of muddle through on their own. And a lot of that is kind of, yeah, like trying to go under the radar and
Yeah, and the thing is, I feel like so much of neurodiversity is assessed on behavior rather than on
sure.
internal experience. It's this whole concept of not fine in school, isn't it? Or fine in school. There's a whole movement called Not Fine in School, which is brilliant. It's a Facebook group if anybody is interested, which is basically about how to fight against that narrative which says, well, they're fine in school, so the subtext of that is it must be something you're doing at home. That's not what teachers, I don't think, generally mean, but what they're saying is we're not seeing what you're telling us. So if they're not having a meltdown in school, they're saving it for us. It's so kind when they do that.
Yeah.
That just isn't something that the school is experiencing. So if the school isn't experiencing the outward behaviors of neurodiversity or neurodivergence in your child, you need to tell them because they don't know. And if you get well, they're fine in school, then the obvious response is, well, they're not fine after school.
So did your son have any issues going to school, like in terms of the transition in the morning? Because I know that can be a thing for quite a lot of neurodivergent kids.
Yes, is the short answer. In year 2, when he was really struggling to go in, we had a couple of issues with it. Was the transition between obviously being at home and being at school in the mornings, and he'd be okay until we were in the car, and then the school had promised that if he was having a tricky day, we could bring him in through the front instead of through the playground. And also there was a quiet room that had like a fish bubble lamp in it, and he could go in there if he was upset and didn't want his friends to see that he was upset. It never happened. And
Right.
all the times that he went in, it's all right, I'll go in the fish room. Or even when they'd meet him and say he can go in the fish room for a bit, what actually then happened after he left me was that they'd go past the room and it was busy, or it was locked, or somebody else came out and said, come on, you can go into class now. So that was a promise that wasn't delivered.
Yeah.
So my son just stopped having any faith that they would take that seriously. The worst one I remember was one morning when we had phoned and said he's having difficulty coming, and I'd asked to have a meeting with the teacher, and the teacher said that she would meet us at the door. So I took him in. He was really upset. I took him in. By the time we got there, he'd kind of got himself together a bit. And the head teacher then came, met me at the door, and basically ushered my son away. And I said, oh, I promised I'd stay with him until he felt better. And the head teacher said something like, it's okay. No, he's all right with me, aren't you? And then asked my son, who obviously said yes. And it all happened so quickly. And I was so kind of sideswiped by it that I didn't really think about it. And I just was fuming afterwards because I thought, I've now broken my promise. I promised him I would stay with him until he felt safe or until he was okay. And here's this guy pitching up and just basically swooping my child away, who I know is still upset and who I've promised a certain type of transition to. And I vowed that I would never let that happen again. So I would say, stand your ground. If your child needs a transition time between yourself and a teacher, needs to have a few minutes with both of you there, or if you've promised them anything along those lines, just say, look, no, this is what I promised my child, because they have to believe that you're going to do what you say you're going to do. Otherwise, getting over that difficulty that they're having is just going to be so much harder.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned earlier, like the pathway coordinator. Has anyone else supported you doing this journey? Were there kind of like resources online that you found helpful? Like I'm thinking if other parents are like thinking, oh, maybe there is something going on with my kid and like, where can I go to for a reliable source of information?
It's a really good question, because I think pre-diagnosis, which is basically his whole life up until a few months ago, I dealt with the kind of imposter syndrome of maybe he's neurotypical and I'm just a rubbish parent, or maybe I'm just seeing things that aren't there, but nonetheless, I've kind of fought through that and tried to access as much as I could. So I just joined a number of Facebook groups. I did use the pathway coordinator that we have here. And in your area, feel free to reach out and ask your NHS team or whoever it is, is there anybody that can help to guide me through this? and just other parents, I guess, who have been on the journey before. I know you and I have talked a lot, both pre and post diagnosis for our boys, and people who are just quite reassuring about, it doesn't matter whether they are or they aren't in terms of a diagnosis. Here's some practical ways to help with various issues that they might be having. And again, with Penguin Parenting, especially the bedtime series that we've just done, for example, it's not exclusively content for neurodivergent children. However, if you have a neurodivergent child, the chances are they're going to have more issues with bedtime than perhaps a neurotypical child might. But I think basically, if you've got a younger child and you don't know but you suspect, trust your gut, and just meet whatever those needs are, right? It's okay to kind of curate a world for your child that works for them. If they don't want to do extracurricular clubs, don't do them. If they struggle with transitions going to school, talk to the school and make them put reasonable adjustments. That's your phrase, reasonable adjustments in place to make your child's day easier. If they struggle with bits of uniform, or if they can't do school lunches, all of these things, kind of fight their corner. But within your home, there are just so many ways that you can draw on the experience of parents and people that have kind of further down the journey, and just try different things and see what works for you. That's what we had to do, because I'm sure what works for my son won't necessarily work for your son, because they're also very, very different.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Is there anything else that you think that I've missed about that's been interesting about your experience so far?
One of the biggest things that I try not to get too ranty about, but it's definitely a thing that I think we're going to discuss more, is just around the language that people use, not just to describe autistic people and neurodivergent people and children, but also to kind of encourage, like, to try and make them be a certain way. We talked a bit today about behavior and how everything is judged against behavior, but also I think there's a whole world of change that needs to happen about how we look at people with a different neurotype. I heard it described the other day as being like biodiversity, neurodiversity. We wouldn't want all the plants in the garden to look the same, and they all bring something different. And if we can just adjust our view of neurodiversity to be similar, we're going against monoculture these days. We know that having a field with all the same plant in it is not good for the environment. Likewise, having a society with all the same type in it is not good. So I'm not saying that it doesn't create issues that can be disabling for certain children and adults. That's obviously something that needs to continue to be taken seriously, but to work to look at the difference between what is a disability and what is society disabling your child, I think that's a really interesting area of debate, and I think that's something we'll probably talk about more.
Yeah, it's a great one. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much for letting me interview you on your own podcast. It was really nice hearing more about your experiences, and I'm looking forward to hearing your chats with other parents in this series as it develops.
Thanks, Beccy.